little late. This is Danny Dotson, and today I want to talk about 5 advanced search techniques students should be using more. First thing I want to do is to give you a little bit of information about what I'm going to be doing today. The 5 are OR, so this is the Boolean operator OR, it's not an acronym for something. Truncation, limits and filters, phrase searching, and citation searching. And if you guys have seen these in databases and classes or other search features, these are the ones I am particularly focusing on today. So in the slides, what I'm going to do is to say what these are. I assume most of you know, but just in case, go into why I think they're particularly useful and give some anecdotes from my own credit courses and my visiting classes to give you some context as to why I've come about as these are the 5 that I think people should be using more. And I welcome questions on these, and let's start, I guess. So the first Boolean operator I want to talk about particularly is OR. This is the one that has the ability to have a presence of at least one of the terms listed. The reason why I think people need to be using this is I've noticed that when students are particularly searching for a topic, they only think about one concept. And so this allows you to search for more than one. And I give an example of what happens if you were to search for 2 concepts. This means you would need to do 9 different searches. If you had 2 different concepts and 3 terms for each, you would try to end up doing 9 different searches in order to accomplish the same thing you would be able to do if you just use Boolean operators. And I've actually had people say they prefer to do it that way. I don't quite understand why you would prefer to do many different searches when you can do just one. So it boils down to, it also kind of uses another search function of grouping or nesting that you could do instead of 9 searches, just one search. And in my class, I have students trying to put this together in this type of format so that they can see that they're developing an advanced search, but they're thinking about the alternate terms. So I find that not all students are familiar with the Boolean operators. I'm especially surprised when it's students in a particular major that have been introduced or should have been introduced to Boolean operators that they don't think to apply these to search strategies. Some students don't even think of alternate terms at all. So I have visited classes in the past or in the online credit course that I teach. I have seen students that they want to stick to this one term that they're familiar with. And they don't think that people are using different terminology for the same topic. And as I put it, the English language is very rich, and people often use different terms for the same concept. So we get into the issue that people are using alternate terms. Even for scientific concepts, people might be using different terms. So think about the different terminology that people may use, and I get across to students that you want to use these different terminology that are available and get to know the terminology of the discipline. So the discipline may be using more formal language, whereas you might be using a layman's terms for a particular language. So an example I will give is the term flu. Students might just want to search for flu, and in the professional literature, the term is more likely to be used influenza, or even more specifically, specific flu viruses. And they're counting on the idea they think that the database or search tool is going to somehow know what they mean when they put in flu. And in some cases, it may translate to influenza, like PubMed would probably do so, but another database may not. So I try to get the point across to them that you need to think about the different terminology. And also comparing the syntax to equations. So when I do that, that helps science students a little bit, saying, hey, we're developing just a formula that you can particularly use in order to get across your point. Another topic is truncation. And so one of the things I try to get across to students is to think about the terms that begin with the same root letters. So the star is commonly used. It's also called stemming to truncate things. And basically, the reason I think people should be using this is the terminology that people are using. People often will use different variations of a term or a concept that has the same root. Plurals and singulars is a pretty common one of this, and a lot of databases try to get that, but they don't always get other variations. And you're also counting on the database doing that. And I usually tell people don't trust a database to get all the variety that you would necessarily want. If you have terms that are coming up with the same root, you want to be sure to get that with that truncation. But of course, it's not always perfect. So an example I particularly like to use in my class is if you're looking for topics related to engineering. So if you wanted to learn about women in engineering, for example, you might want to use engineer with a truncation in order to get variations on that. Or if you wanted to deal with engineered products, that would help as well. But if you try to use it with cat, it actually turns into a Batman joke because you're going to get all these variations on cat terms. So that aren't related to the cat that you intend. Yes, it's going to get cat and cats, but it's not going. It's going to get also cataract, catalog, catastrophe. So I always caution students that yes, you can use this, but always be very careful with that. So it seems like most students don't know this, and especially when I'm working in my credit course, a lot of them will say truncation is new. So I have reflection quizzes in my course, and most of them will end up saying something like, I never heard of truncation before. Or when I visit a class, they are blown away by the fact that, oh, I can use this and I can get variations on Babylon when I'm looking for Babylonian mathematics. And some students really enjoy finding this out because they have felt that this is something that has always been problematic with word terms. And I feel that some students also have trouble grasping it until they actually see it in action. So they'll try to put a star after everything, and sometimes they'll put a star like after the plural version, which really isn't useful. So I try to get them to think about, okay, where does it stop that all these variations, what is the root for that, to try to get them across it. And again, some databases will do this, but you're making a lot of assumptions if you don't use it. So is the database going to get plurals? A lot of them will. But is the database going to get engineering if you search for engineer? Who knows? You would have to go to every database to find it out. So usually the skills I try to teach students related to this is to try to get them to do some truncation so that you just don't assume that the database is going to get what you want. Tell the database specifically what you want from this. Limits and filters in databases. So usually the way I frame it is the limits are the things that are before, filters are usually after a search. Sometimes different databases use different languages. So I try to get across to students that seem to want to scroll through results and try to manually weed things out, like this one's not in English, this one's too old. Do that beforehand or do that after your search, whichever is more convenient, and be more specific. So language, format, and year are pretty common. If you only want journal articles, tell that database you only want journal articles. If you don't read German, Russian, whatever, tell the database that. If you only want new stuff, tell it what year is your minimum. Be Do that database justice that it has that power. And when I'm teaching my class, all the databases I use have some sort of limit option, but some of them are databases on steroids when it comes to limit options because some of them have so many limit options you can be extremely specific, and I'm going to point out PubMed in particular. You can be extremely specific with PubMed and say, I only want stuff on animals, I want clinical trials, and I want this, this, and this. Scopus and Web of Science also has them. And Databases usually do only the include. I find that some Scopus, for example, will allow you to exclude things. So you can say, I just don't want to see stuff in this particular language, or I don't want to see patents or something like that, so you can be a little bit more specific rather than just say, I only want these. You could also say, in some cases, I don't want these. So the why, I often find that undergraduates, and that's who I usually see the most, only speak English, and in some cases they're getting stuff that is not in English. So I'm going to pick on, I visit a math history course a lot, and some of the earlier stuff on topics will end up being in Russian and German and occasionally French and a few other languages. So I say use the options to get at what you want. Or they keep seeing older stuff and they're saying, I want newer stuff. So in the credit course I teach, I have students get some pre-2010 research so that they can get later to citation databases and be sure they can find some stuff that has been heavily cited. But I usually say, hey, often when you're doing scientific research, you're wanting newer, the most recent stuff. So instead of looking at those 2000 results and trying to get rid of these things as you pass through and look at things, tell it ahead of time. You only want 2010 to the present. I can't think of a database I use that doesn't allow you to use a year limit. That is probably the most common one. If you are doing a search, a lot of times after a search, they will allow some keyword or subject term features. And I tell students, look at those things. Those are search terms you may want to start incorporating in your search because these, especially in a database that has a very good developed vocabulary for its controlled terms, you're going to have some excellent terms there, but that will also help you to narrow your search down a little bit if you choose that after a search. And again, the big thing is make your job easier. I've heard people who say, I like to go through and make sure I'm not missing something or whatnot. Yes, you might miss something that's good, but in general, when you use these limits, you're getting a lot more focused on the things you want and you're weeding out things. So maybe there's this wonderful article that's in French. If you only need a few articles, don't bother with the French stuff if you don't read French because you're going to have to go through the trouble of trying to get it translated. So again, we have the issue of the filters. I find that people often don't go past the first few pages, and that includes me often. So I usually try to make sure that I'm getting stuff that is right on target. So the filters and limits will allow you to get more on focused in on what you want to do. But I also find that people tend to get frustrated if they start going past multiple pages and they think the database has failed them. Well, maybe the first few pages are the types of items you're not wanting. So get rid of those ahead of time. So say you're looking at search results in a database that includes things like conference papers or patents or tech reports, and those just happen to float to the top. If you're really wanting journal articles, tell the database you only want journal articles so you don't have to read all that stuff. And I think it's just the people have gotten into the habit because of general search tools like Google. I'm going to search. I'm going to put some search terms in a box and scroll through the pages and see what I can find. Well, use the power of these databases. Google's a wonderful tool, but it doesn't have quite the same filter, limit, and all these other capabilities that some of these major research databases do. Take advantage of those to get more precisely what you want. And one of the other things I found that some people, even when they see the value of it, they neglect to use them. So one of the things I will suggest is that one of the interesting things that people don't realize is if you're really interested in animals and you're looking for something on them, PubMed has a limit to say, I'm really wanting to see research that's dealing specifically with animals. And you might get some, and I purposely said non-human medical research here because I once did have a student say, well, you realize that humans are animals? Yes, I do, but that's the PubMed limit. PubMed says animals, and so what you can do is focus in on non-human research by clicking that limit, and you're not seeing all this stuff that's involving humans as well that maybe got bit by a dog or whatnot. Somehow the dog comes into play or whatever the animal is comes to play. You're going to see the research specifically on animals. and people are really surprised at the power that some of these databases have to offer. Phrase searching. So this is my current pet peeve. Usually, when I'm teaching my class, I find my online class, I usually find that students there's one thing that students just don't seem to be grasping, and right now it's phrase searching. And so, phrase searching, most of you probably know, put quotes around something in almost any search tool, and it's going to look for that exact phrase. So, Ohio State with quotes around it is different than Ohio State without quotes around it. Why it's important? You're being exact. You're telling the search tool, I want that exact phrase to appear. Otherwise, those terms might not be together, and you're really not getting what you're after. But as I found in my practice of teaching this class, it can also result in major problems. So if you don't use phrase searching, what you can find is that, for example, in a citation database, if you're looking for the affiliation of the author, and in the sciences especially, you're going to have dozens of authors, you might find that Ohio appears in one affiliation and state appears in another, and it's going to tell you that this matches your result. And yes, it does, because you didn't search precisely enough. But the even bigger issue is when you start to combine it with Boolean operators, some oddities can come up. So I would say, if you guys want to have some fun, see what happens when you type United States without quotes around it, or Canada, and plug it into different databases. You're going to find different databases behave differently. So I actually showed students to try to drive home the point of using phrase searching, that some databases will do this as a phrase search. That's pretty rare. Most databases will interpret this as an and between United and States. But does it do United and States together and then or Canada, or does it do United and States or Canada together? Or does it do something weird? And I found one database that I still have no clue what it did when you did a search like this. But at the heart of it is, it doesn't do what the user's intent was. So this is the pet peeve I have right now with things that students just don't seem to be grasping. I introduce it, show all sorts of examples, and yet when I see students trying to plan their search strategy, I see them putting two words together and no quotes around them. They somehow still think that it's going to magically know that they want that as an exact phrase, and I have to give them feedback and say, you need to put quotes around this because it's not what you're intending to do. And often they're combining it with Boolean operators, and it's going to be a problem. And I got a little ahead of myself. So the other example is with citation databases. You could be finding Ohio and state in very different areas of a record, but not necessarily together. And in some cases, you're going to be okay, but if you're using a database that does something really goofy when you combine two words together without the phrase searching and a Boolean operator, you may be getting some very messed up results. And the students will often say the database didn't give me good results. Well, it's because, let's backtrack, the search is the problem, and the more precise search would have gotten you to what you needed to do, and it was the way it was entered. And citation searching. So I do introduce students in my class, and it's an undergrad 3000 level class, to citation searching. So I like to frame it, and when I introduce this in classes as well, as a reverse bibliography. So, and it's getting less students are often seem to be being told, look at a bibliography to find additional works. Some students have been told that with Wikipedia, so that's a good in as well. But I say, hey, what if you were able to reverse it and see what bibliographies contain this item? And then I show them search tools like Web of Science, and usually for the sciences I focus on Scopus. But I also look at Google Scholar in a lot of classes, and because Google Scholar, some people have run across the citation searching elements, so they're not as surprised as they used to be. But I think some people are surprised at the value of this, and also the ability that if you find a wonderful article on a topic, you're going to get something uh, both forward in time and back in time from that particular item. And at times I also describe it as a bit of a conversation. So this one article built upon these other articles, it talked about them, and now more articles are talking about it. So one if you find one on-topic article, you can find a lot of things. I often point that if you can find a really good article that is also heavily cited, there's probably a good reason for that, and you really want to check out that article and see what's going on. On occasion, maybe there are a lot of people that really hated that article and are refuting it for some reason. Maybe there was a lot of bad research in it. Um, so, for example, the very famous anti-vaccine article. But in general, most of these articles are being cited because of the sign of quality and importance to the topic. So the value of going to a search tool like Scopus or Web of Science and sorting by the time cited once you've done a search, you can find some very valuable research. And also, some classes have focused on students talking to researchers, and Scopus and Web of Science are valuable for finding people at specific institutions for you to interview and get one-on-one information from a researcher as well. So this is something that I have shown in my class, but also to some undergrad classes, especially ones that have that interview component. And students are really surprised at this level of detail that you can get. And again, I think Google Scholar has decreased that a little bit, but I think most of them are still surprised at the value of this. I'm also a little surprised that students are um, not as commonly being told to look at bibliographies. Many are, but I expect to see more hands when I ask such a question in a class. But I do emphasize the fact that this is that option, but also going forward in time as well. And I think students find it neat to find stuff from their institution that they're at. And being at Ohio State, it's pretty rare that we don't find something that is authored by an OSU researcher. But I think it's also interesting that students at often find something in a department they're not suspecting. So at OSU, we might have people doing research on something that's on our ag research campus. And so we get a lot of results from there, and people are expecting it to be in a specific department, and they're often surprised that, oh, I would assume that this person was at physics in the physics department, and this person is at our ag research campus. So a lot of students at the beginning are inclined to try to go to a specific department and find somebody that is doing research on their area. And it's not the wrong way to do it, but it's also a way to do it that is a little bit cumbersome. Search your topic in one of these databases, limit to Ohio State, and find somebody who's doing research, verify they're still at OSU, but you may find they're at a different department. And again, I do use Web of Science and Scopus in my class, and I often find that when I ask students about their favorite search tools, they often bring up Web of Science or Scopus. I also a little bit of a pessimist in this regards because it's the last search tools they use in the class, so it could be they're fresh in the memory, but usually one of those two are pretty prominent in what students are saying are their favorites. Okay, so I have presented my five, and I wanted to open this up for further discussion. If you guys have questions for me, I am happy to open them, and I think there may be some things in chat, so let me go to that. And let me get past all the wondering where I am. Sorry about that again. Okay, somebody said Primo from ProQuest does not use truncation. Uh, I hate when databases don't allow you to use truncation. It really frustrates me when you see that a database doesn't use a certain advanced search feature that you like. And somebody said their institution's version does allow. Uh, let's see. Somebody mentioned the braces and Scopus for a certain symbol. Not sure I've used braces and Scopus. I've used other things. Assessment. So Brian asked about assessment. So I do it more because it's an online class. What I do is I look at some of the system generated information, but what I find far more valuable is I give the students a course in the course survey that asks some very pointed questions, and I use that to help redesign the course. But as I go along, I also take notes, and I kind of refer to it as plugging one hole and then waiting for another one to open. So this year, this summer, I'm going to be trying to add some content to address again the issue of phrase searching, and I'm going to expect something else in the coming academic year. Is probably going to say, okay, here's my annoyance this year. They're not getting this. What can I do to make sure that they get this? And so I will come up with more examples or maybe other activities to try to drive home the phrase searching component. But yes, I do assessment, but it's not quite to the degree of like pre-test and post-test. I don't do quite that level, but what I do is I expect everybody. I would love for everybody to get an A, and if I see people not getting something, and I want to try to see what can help them get that, what future students to not replicate those errors. Okay, Jeffrey asked about my credit course. So I teach a credit course that is called Online Research in the Science Literature. It's a 2 credit hour online only class that is a 7 week class at OSU. It's a 3,000 level class, 3142 pi, if anybody is wondering why I did that number. And it's focusing on using basically science research tools, but also getting familiar with the resources that are used in the sciences. But I also commonly visit courses in my 6 departments that I work with. Uh, Math history has been the one I've been visiting the most, but I've also lately been visiting a lot of geography classes and a few other courses here and there, like civil engineering sometimes. So, but math history is the longest term one, so that's why I kept coming up with Babylonian mathematics as an example for that. Um, and yes, I'm embedded in some courses, math history in particular. I work with a little bit more in depth, including working with they're trying to get their assignments quality. So I actually look at their annotated bibliographies and advise them as to other places to look for more information. I can share the slides, Jane. I don't have any handouts in particular, but I could, if you want a syllabus, you can email me, dotson.77. I can type that into chat, and I can certainly share with you additional content as well. And I have handouts that I and LibGuides, but in terms of a lot of what I'm talking about, a lot of that is contained in my class, and I can share stuff with you if you want to. Just send me an email. So Jeffra, my credit course is actually not required, although one of our regional classes has asked that they have a session on their class taught by their regional librarian, and we're going to be looking at setting that up for fall, and I'm not sure if they're going to require it for some of their students, but this one is an elective, and to be frank, I get a lot of students that have had to drop a class, but some are doing it because they intend to go to graduate school and do research. So it's a mix of why people are teaching that particular class. And Allison shared my full contact information if you want that. But to continue with the information for Jeffra, I would encourage you to do something like this because I find it very rewarding and uh, most disappointing to hear is that students wish they had taken the class earlier in their career. At OSU, I do get some juniors and seniors in my class, sometimes quite a number of seniors, and some of them are pretty disappointed that they had not encountered this earlier because they felt that their searches have uh, improved a lot since teaching the course. And usually I get some students saying, hey, I've been using this in my other classes and it's helping me. But it's pretty disappointing that I get people lamenting that I've gone here to OSU for so many years and now I'm just learning these skills that could have helped me all along.
I see someone else is typing in the chat. This is Allison, the moderator. Thank you, Danny, for leading this great discussion today. If you have any more questions or comments, type them in the chat box now. I wanted to draw your attention, though, to the link where the recording will be posted also. And we see a question coming in also, so we will hold off for a moment before closing to see if there's any other questions. Thank you.
So, one thing that we are looking at doing is to do something more explicit with our uh, intro writing courses, and so that's in development. But a lot of what we have talked about is a train the trainers type thing for the intro writing courses, which can help getting at some of these skills. But uh, I think one of the drawbacks to that is I think people develop a bit of a comfort set when it comes to databases. So one of my cringe points is when there's a science student that says they're using JSTOR as their major database. Not that I particularly dislike JSTOR, I just don't think it's the best database to be used for in-depth science research. And so I think it's valuable that this be addressed in their intro writing courses, but that I would really love to see more students get this into uh, their curriculum at some point more for their major as well, especially. I'm a science librarian, so especially the sciences for me, but I think it would be good that all majors at some point see more of this that targets their major so we're not getting students that are relying on the more general search tools for everything. So yes, Allison does make a good point. So there are some databases, and the one where I do point out the issue with some of the advanced features the most is PubMed. If you do use some of these advanced search features, it actually turns off any mapping they may have done behind the scenes. So if you were to use truncation, for example, in PubMed, it it often overrides some things. Uh, and quotation marks also, as Allison points out, it does often override some of those things. But on the flip side, I do usually encourage students to think about variations. The one problem I do point out to students, though, is most databases don't distinguish between US or us, so I usually discourage them from using US as a search term uh, because most databases just see US as us, and both of those would get results. But the mapping uh, is a good point, though. If you do put quotes in around the United States, it may not get that mapping. Rebecca asked about some more advanced tools that are on the horizon that or have recently come out. No, I have not tried those, and I don't believe we have either of those at OSU, but I could take a look. I know that are some that I have seen come across that seem interesting, uh, but I do not use those. And free versions of both of those, I'll have to take a look at those too. And I'm actually writing that down. One of the other examples, while I'm thinking about it, one of my major pet peeves with most databases is that they don't have um, a way to find geography as a search term that excludes locations of authors. So a lot of databases, because they search the entire record, if the United States or the United Kingdom or whatever is mentioned somewhere in the uh, item as a place for the author or their institution or something like that, but what you're really after is information about the location. Sometimes that's a little harder to do. So I try to get students across that if you really want to do this, you probably want to search just in the abstract for the geographic terms. And Marion said that there's a guide at UCLA's Biomed Library that could be modified for those databases. So I'll throw a question back to you guys since we have a few more minutes. Is there a certain advanced search feature or syntax or something like that that you regularly use that you think students should be using that I didn't talk about today? Yes, Jeffra, I would agree that subject terms, I often point those out, especially for PubMed and some databases that have a very strong controlled vocabulary. Some others, not so much, so I don't often point them out for certain databases. But usually, if I'm using a database where I feel it has extremely strong controlled vocabulary, I say, you need to look at these. Mary mentioned review articles. I don't see those as often in the hard sciences, which is mostly what I use, but I do find those on occasion. But in PubMed, if I deal with the life sciences at all, I always say if you can find a really good review article, that's going to be extremely helpful to you. Emily brought up proximity operators. I do mention that in my class, but I stick mostly to phrase searching just because every database seems to want to use a different term for that or a different way to do that. And I don't want to bog down students with they're using 8 article databases ultimately in my class, and I don't want them to be overwhelmed. But yes, proximity operators can help, especially when terms are often used close together, but not always right next to each other. And let's see, did I miss something? Yes, I also mentioned the difference between a cited reference search and just clicking on the number of times cited. Um, One of the things that, while Allison mentions Web of Science, I do bring up in to some people, usually to faculty more than anything, is they often use terms that are related to Web of Science, thinking it's universal, and I have to remind them this is proprietary. So some of these terms that you're referring to, you can't get this by that you can't get this thing you're after by looking at other databases. They might have something similar, but you're not going to get this exact terminology because it's actually a proprietary thing, such as impact factor. If you can't create an impact factor for your journal, you can create something similar, but if it's not in journal citation reports, it doesn't exist. Um, Allison brings up a good point. Some things are miscited, and what I really and I usually encounter this more one-on-one with students, but I do find that people often cite citations. Uh, and by that, what I mean is they see it cited in another paper, and so they cite it themselves without ever looking at it. So I often find that sometimes people are citing an abstract that they found in a published list of abstracts, and they're reading a lot into that abstract sometimes. But I also find that there is actually a very famous example of somebody did a sample citation for a fake thing, and it got cited in papers. So that was kind of funny in a way, but scary in a way. But people often um, miscite things. Yes, people do cite book reviews, or they think a book review is an actual article, or they're citing the book review thinking it's a lot of detail about a paper, and really it's just a review. So I do find there's a lot of sloppiness when it comes to what people are reading. Um, well, I got another few minutes. Another issue with searching is that I do really try to drive home the point when I visit classes that the peer review limit in most databases is at the journal level, because I find people depend upon that too much and they think it's at the article level. And so they will get editorials and news articles and things like that in peer reviewed journals such as Nature and think that it's a full peer reviewed article and use it in their classes. And I try to drive home the point that don't trust that little option. Christy asked predatory journals and or publishers. I really don't address that to a good degree. It is addressed a little bit when they're introduced to issues like open access or other things that not all journals are created or peer review rather. That not all journals are created equal, and peer review is not consistent. Peer review isn't a 100% sign of quality. So I usually encourage students to treat all journals uh, with the idea that you need to evaluate it for yourself. Don't assume just because it's in a peer review it's not perfect. But I really don't get too very deep at all into the issue of predatory journals or quality of specific titles or publishers. I did have to correct a few students once who came across who were using the old-fashioned idea that .com is bad. Well, that's where most of the journal literature is. Uh, WOS Web of Science. And Judy recommended a site called Think Check Submit. I think I've seen that before, so I will keep that in mind. And Marion mentioned another LibGuide. I think we were at time. Does anybody have any last minute questions? And again, sorry for the delay in getting started. If you guys have questions, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and I can also share you um, information about my course if you want to send me an email at dotson.77@osu.edu, or some of the LibGuides I developed. You can actually go to library.osu.edu and go to our course and subject guides and look at those. We have a few more people typing, and I think they might just be thank you. So
Thank you, Danny. This has been such a practical kind of a topic that we tend to, sometimes get lost in all of the other things that surround, our library instruction, and just getting back to the basic of, the power and features of the databases is really helpful for me personally anyway. So I'm very grateful to you. And it looks like by the audience reaction, everybody is thankful as well.
okay.
And we really appreciate your patience, everyone. Sorry for the technical issues. I was thinking it's probably Monday, but fortunately for us, it's already Wednesday. So, all right, have a great day, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Jane, I will put the address in again for the archive and where we will upload the slides and the recording. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys, and feel free to send me an email.